have examined various aspects of collaboration, the definition, and so on and so forth. Today we look and focus in, at this session at least, on a very specific aspect, and that is, of course, Ukrainians in military formations, both in the Red Army and elsewhere, and specifically within German military formations and German administration. Our first distinguished speaker is Professor Potichnyj, Professor of Political Science at McMaster University, and recently bestowed the honor of being the first Canadian to be nominated and appointed Professor of Heilongjiang, is that close? University in the city of Harbin in China. Without further ado, Professor Potichnyj.
Thank you very much. Let me assure you I will not be speaking in Chinese. Now, it is often said that Jews are responsible for this, or that Jews are responsible for that. It is quite clear to me that if it were not for the Jews, we wouldn't have had this conference. So I feel, therefore, that we should be very grateful to them for this opportunity to meet and to discuss some of these very important matters. Before I begin with the topic that was assigned to me, I would like to say that there exists a great deal of confusion on the matter of Ukrainians and their behavior in a period just prior to World War II, during the war and immediately after. This confusion is not entirely limited to non-Ukrainians. 40 years after the war, the Ukrainians themselves are hazy on a number of issues that affected them vitally 4 decades ago and influenced their thinking to this day. As far as the world at large is concerned, the World War II has no mysteries. It was a gigantic struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and the forces of good had triumphed. It follows from this that whole nations, as well as individual human beings, found themselves either on one side or the other. Anybody who was not on the side of the Allies, one should exclude the neutral countries, of course, by definition must have been on the side of the Axis powers, or worse yet, on the side of the Nazis. Anything that does not fit this pattern is either overlooked and or quite often totally misunderstood. A large portion of what we are talking about here today falls into this category. Having said that, let me make another, quote, amazing, unquote, statement. Namely, that Ukrainians during World War II have collaborated with absolutely everybody who was anybody at all. I could very well end my presentation here, but since I came all the way from Hamilton and already wasted some of the organizers' money by not being able to fall asleep in Park Plaza, I think I should say a few things more on the subject. The first question is, what made Ukrainians into such devoted collaborators? One rather obvious answer is their numbers. There are plenty of them, some 40 million or so. The other answer, also obvious, at least to the Ukrainians, is that they, the largest nation in the world, without their own sovereign state, were not in charge of their destiny at that crucial juncture of world history. The third answer is that not unlike the Jews, they were and are scattered all over the world. Therefore, one should not be surprised to find them in all kinds of strange places and situations. Here again, it is a question of perspective. Ukrainians see themselves as Ukrainians or as members of one nation, good or bad, all over the world. Others see Ukrainians in other terms, as Americans, as Poles, or as, God forbid, the Russians. And for them, the very term Ukrainian is reduced to a particular grouping with a particular ideology and characteristic, most of it negative in content. Thus, all Ukrainians are peasants, drunkards, fascist pigs, racists, and anti-Semites. Example of this can be found from time to time even in our Canadian press. But let me return to the question of collaboration for a minute and give you a few examples. In 1979, when I visited China for the first time, I found myself in the city of Harbin, where at one time Ukrainian social, economic, cultural, and political life was highly visible. It must have been a well-to-do community. Its church is beautiful, and its cultural center overshadows anything that the Ukrainians in New York City have today. So I asked my Chinese guides about the Ukrainians. They shook their heads in sympathy and said that many of them were Japanese collaborators. Many were Soviet stooges. Some were working for Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang. And yes, a few, very few, very good Ukrainians, they were helping the Chinese communists. But when I asked for numbers, nobody could supply them. So there must have been very few indeed. Some of you are probably wondering, what is this chap talking about? Who cares about some forsaken city in China? The events we are discussing have to do with Europe. I will come to that, of course. But what I wanted to underline by this anecdotal reference is that Ukrainians are found all over the world, and they were and are involved in a number of enterprises, some of very dubious character. But let's move to Europe in our story. The first thing that strikes you is that Ukrainians participated in World War II in large numbers, on all fronts, and in various uniforms. This is not surprising. World War II's fiercest battles were fought on their territory. Just for the heck of it, notice that I refrained from using the proper but a much stronger expression, my consideration for the youth present here in large numbers. So just for the heck of it, let us look at this question in greater detail. All of this is, of course, known. I'm just repeating well-known facts. Millions of Ukrainians served in the Soviet army. There are Soviet statistics. 409,668 Ukrainians were decorated with medals for bravery in the war. 961 became heroes of the Soviet Union. Some 300,000 Ukrainians served in the Soviet partisan units. Thousands of Ukrainians served in the Polish army of General Anders and fought with this army in Egypt, Libya, and later on in Italy. The Poles have a song about the red poppies on Monte Cassino, Czerwone maki na Monte Cassino, which speaks about the flower of Polish youth being cut down by the hail of German bullets. Somebody calculated that every fifth poppy on that hill, so foolishly fought for in a typical Polish fashion, commemorates a Ukrainian boy. Ukrainians fought also in the Polish units which advanced with the Soviet army into Poland. Ukrainians served in the Czechoslovak units attached to the Western Allied forces. Ukrainians also served in the Czechoslovak brigade of General then Colonel Ludwik Svoboda. Of 15,000 soldiers, 11,000 of them were Ukrainians. Most of them joined the brigade after 3 years sojourn in the Soviet concentration camps where they were kept since 1940. Ukrainians served in the Romanian army. Ukrainians served in the Hungarian army. And they played an important role in bringing about peace between the Hungarian army and the Ukrainian insurgent army, or the UPA, and the Ukrainian underground. Ukrainians fought on the side of the Serbian monarchist Draža Mihailović, and yes, on the side of Tito's partisans. A large number of Ukrainians served in the US and Canadian forces, and believe it or not, they could be found among the French resistance units, both those of them who were residents of France and those units who deserted from the German army. And finally, there were Ukrainians who served on the German side. Mr. Yurkevich is going to deal with that matter in more detailed fashion, but I should say a few things about it here as well. There are various estimates of the numbers. Some run as high as 2 million. But if one excludes the non-military units, then we are talking about 900,000, or roughly 1 million people. Some of you will say, finally we are getting somewhere. There were 1 million Nazi sympathizers among the Ukrainians. This conclusion is not justified. Let us look more closely at some of these units. They can be divided into two broad categories. To the first category belong the three so-called Ukrainian legions. The Division Halachina, the Ukrainian Liberation Forces or Army, Ukrainskie Vyzvolne Vійсько, the Ukrainian National Army, and some units of the Russian Liberation Army of Vlasov. All of them came into being on the basis of a political agreement of sorts with the German authorities. Some of the above actually designations or names refer to the same units, as we shall see shortly, even though the names nomenclature has been changed. The second group comprises those units which were organized by the Germans without any regard to political consideration of any sort. These are guards and construction units, and they were known under various names, such as Werkschutz, Hilfswillige, or Hivis Baudienst, and of course the Ukrainian auxiliary police. Here I should say also belong such units as the Sumy division, which was a frontline unit used in the Battle of Stalingrad, and whose remnants later on were included in the UVV or UVV, Ukrainskie Vyzvolne Vійсько, or UNA, Ukrainska Nationalna Armia. Let us now look at some of these creations in greater detail, and let me begin with the first group, those who came into being as a result of some political arrangements. In the first formation of this type is the Ukrainian Legion under the leadership of Colonel Sushko, which was organized by the OUN leadership, still a unified force at that time, with the blessing and support of the Germans just prior to the war with Poland. It lasted or existed for a very short time and was liquidated when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement came into effect. Many of its members later on found themselves within the Ukrainian auxiliary police, Werkschutz units, and in the Baudienst. Its real importance lie in the fact that it tried to renew the traditions from the period of World War I, when the Legion was to become a nucleus of the Ukrainian army. The second Ukrainian Legion, which like the first was organized with the understanding and support of the Germans, but under the auspices of the OUN Bandera faction, because by then the OUN has split, is also known under the name of Дружини Українських Націоналістів. It comprised two groups, the northern one, the Nachtigall, and the southern one, the Roland. It had some 1,000 men in connection with the proclamation of the Ukrainian state in June 1941 in Lviv, and the arrest of the OUN B leadership. Both battalions were returned to Frankfurt on Oder, and there reformed into a police battalion, 201, which was sent to Belarusia to combat the Red Partisans. Here again, because of various complaints of the Ukrainians and insubordination, almost all Ukrainian officers were arrested and the unit was disbanded. One of the officers of this unit was Captain Roman Shukhevich. He escaped and later became the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian insurgent army, UPA, and the head of the Ukrainian underground until his death in a battle with the MVD troops in March 1950 near Lviv. However, the most important regular unit, which was organized in mid-1943, was the Division Halichina, or the 14th Grenadier Division of the Waffen-SS. The formation of this unit was surrounded with a great deal of controversy. The Ukrainian underground circles were strongly opposed to its formation in the beginning, but once it became a fait accompli, they used it to train their own people. Later on, these trainees deserted and rejoined the underground. Also, a large number of men joined the underground after the division was destroyed at the Battle of Brody in 1944. The remnants, I should say, were formed into another division, which became the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army. It is this unit that creates controversy to this day in Canada. The Canadian Jewish Congress opposed the permission of the Canadian government to admit its members into this country. The unit was a frontline unit and was never used against the Jews. The charges stem from the fact that it was a volunteer unit and as such allegedly full of Nazi sympathizers. At the end of the war, even the Soviets were not able to come up with any specific charges against this division, but there is another paper, as I said, that will deal with this subject matter, perhaps in greater detail. There were in existence several units which were formed from the Red Army prisoner of wars at the end of 1942. Many Ukrainians served in the ROA under command of General Vlasov, but some units came into being at the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942. As I mentioned before, the Sumy Division is a case in point here. It was organized by the Germans, and it was a frontline unit which took part in the battle for Stalingrad. Its remnants were first attached to the ROA and later on to the Ukrainian Liberation Army, or UVV. The UVV came into being in the spring of 1944, when as a result of Ukrainian protests, all Ukrainian units were separated from the Russian Liberation Army and formed into UVV. And the Sumy Division was one of the important units within it. The second important unit, which was formed at the beginning of 1945 near Berlin, was the anti-tank brigade Vilna Ukraina, or Free Ukraine. The officers and the non-coms of this unit were all former Red Army men. The recruits came mostly from the Berlin fire brigades, 85% of which were allegedly composed of Ukrainians. This anti-tank brigade was organized on a territorial principle. The company of Merhorod, company of Lubny, company of Chernihiv, and so on. At the end of 1944, the Ukrainian National Committee came into being in Berlin, and General Pavlo Shandruk became its head. In a very difficult situation, pressed from all sides, the Germans finally agreed to the formation of the Ukrainian National Army. All Ukrainian units were to be brought together under one command. The core of the army was to be the reorganized division Hrycenko, now the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army. This plan was never actually realized because of the German collapse, but the fact that the Germans consented to give control to Ukrainians over these units became quite important immediately after the capitulation of Germany, because it gave Ukrainians a free hand to deal with the Allies on their own. I should perhaps mention one more unit that underscores rather clearly the fact that Ukrainians were quite unreliable whenever removed from the Eastern Front. 2 battalions of the 30th Infantry Division, which were composed of Ukrainian forced laborers to Germany, who were, I should add, forcibly impressed into service, were sent to fight the French underground. In late fall of 1944, these units deserted to the French side and became part of the Force Française de l'Intérieur, where they were known as the Bohun and Shevchenko battalions, or later as the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian Battalion. Both of these units were liquidated at the express request of the Soviet authorities at the end of 1944. Still another Ukrainian unit within French resistance was the group of Lieutenant Kruchkovsky. These were soldiers of 3 battalions of the Hrycenko Division, which were sent to the west and immediately tried to desert to the French side. The attempt was thwarted by the Germans, but a small group did desert while the rest were shipped back to Germany. The second group, those organized by the Germans without any agreement with the Ukrainians, were the units of, as already I mentioned, Werkschutz, Hilfswillige, Baudienst, and the SS Zicklinge. These were young boys between 15 and 18 years of age. The general estimate of all of these forces is that there were roughly 800,000 men in these units. They were mostly former Red Army men who joined these units to virtually saved their lives, since they were not covered by the Geneva Convention. These POWs were treated by the Germans in a most inhuman manner. More about these units probably will be said by Mr. Yurij. The last group that I would like to mention does fall in a special category. These were the people who chose a third alternative. According to Professor Subtelny, there were only two alternatives, either Soviet or German. This third alternative did not present itself immediately, of course, and came to the fore only when the brutality of the German regime and its stand on the question of Ukrainian statehood was no longer a mystery. I'm speaking, of course, of the various formations of the Ukrainian underground. If one speaks chronologically, the first guerrilla unit was that of Taras Bulba Borovets, which is known under various names as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, Polska Sich, UNRWA, and so on. Initially, its political connections were to the former UNR, or the government of 1920s in Ukraine circles. Later on, it was also associated with the OUN-M. The OUN-M also had its own smaller units in various parts of the Ukraine. But the largest underground movement was organized by the OUN-B, or the Bandera faction, although later it has outgrown the OUN framework itself. The UPA, whose beginnings should be placed in 1942, became a large popular force, with the result that it was necessary to create a Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council to lead this struggle. There is no need to go into details of this movement. Suffice it to say that it was active well into 1950s until it was liquidated by the Soviets. There is a great deal of misconception about this formation as well. It has to do with several points. One has to do with the origin of the unit. And therefore, quite often in the West, the approach to this question is a very simple one. Nationalists, many of whom have been in earlier formations associated with the Germans, have been in fact creators of the underground, so therefore by definition they are fascists. Question of membership as well. After all, once the formation began to operate, obviously all of the organized nationalists were members of it. Also, large numbers of the members of the auxiliary police forces, particularly in Volyn region, have joined the units. Not only that, as I have mentioned before, the members of the Hrycenko division also deserted in large numbers into Ukrainian underground. So therefore, if you read either rather uninformed writings in the West, or if you read everything that emanates from the USSR, and there is an absolute avalanche of publications on that score, you come to the conclusion, very simple conclusion, that indeed, because of this, the Ukrainian underground was simply created by the Germans in order to fight against the Soviets, and as such, it was simply harboring all of kinds of war criminals that you could possibly imagine. Now, what is not stressed is that the UPA had membership from all areas of Ukraine, and the Red Army soldiers are also members of these formations. In fact, some of the leading officers, and also in the political side of this question or formation, you find many people from the areas controlled by the USSR up to 1939. Let me simply mention one very prominent one, a leader or the person in charge of the propaganda bureau of the Luhovy was a former Komsomol member of the Komsomol. Also, if you read, for example, publications such as Shumuk's and others, you will discover that even the members of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine, not many of them, but some of them, found themselves eventually in these underground units. Now, as I say, there is no need perhaps to go into details because these stories are well known. One question, nevertheless, remains, and after all, we are dealing here, and the central question is the relations of Ukrainians and Jews. So therefore, I think it is necessary, perhaps for me, to look at that question as well, particularly the relations of the underground and the Jews. Professor Hunchak reported on the resolutions of the Second Congress. He also reported on the resolutions of the Third Congress. But I must say, to my sorrow, that there was never a statement issued in defense of the Jews. There was a statement accusing the Jews. There was a statement which did not mention them, but supposedly gave them rights. There was never a statement issued, unfortunately, by the Ukrainian underground and its leadership in defense of the Jews. Why not? No one to this date has answered this question to my satisfaction. Accusations of UPA destroying Jewish camps also abound. Now, this is also a very confused and very unclear problem. There are conflicting evidence here. For example, is there an evidence that UPA units actually went after the Jewish camps and destroyed them? Well, we have a statement by Professor Weiss from Yad Vashem that in fact indicates that some UPA units protected some of the Jewish camps in the forests. Does that mean, therefore, that what we are talking about is that these were perhaps Jewish partisan units or Jews within the Red partisan units which were attacked by the UPA and destroyed? It is not entirely clear. Let me simply say that indeed in this situation, very difficult situation, the Jews had indeed only one choice, and that is to rely on the help from the Soviet Union, which did not always come at the critical point. In fact, we have some, for example, indications that the Jewish partisan units that existed and even camps were destroyed by the Red partisans. So it is indeed a very, very confusing situation. There is a question of the membership of Jews in the UPA. There is some indication that indeed Jewish doctors, physicians, were members of the UPA. However, I have at least of one testimony of a very highly placed regional OUN officer. And he told me about the story in Rohatin, on Rohatinshchina. He said something like this. When the UPA units began to operate, and even prior to this, various underground smaller units, not the UPA, but smaller even units were being organized in 1942, early 1942, some young Jews approached him and offered to serve in these units. And he said, they simply put it in those terms. You are being now pressed by the Germans. We are being destroyed by the Germans. Let's cooperate. He said, I related that request to the higher authorities. I have never heard a reply to that request. So, what does it tell us? It tells us what we all know, that Ukrainians and Jews not only did not see eye to eye, they obviously were suspicious of each other. And let me also add here that in my view, a very tragic event for the Ukrainians, and perhaps an event which is to be praised on the Jewish side, just prior to World War II, poisoned the atmosphere even worse. Of course, I'm talking about the death of Petlura, killing of Petlura, which then was used by everybody, Ukrainians and Jews and non-Ukrainians and non-Jews, to actually bring this suspicion and hatred to the hot pitch. I suspect, I cannot answer that question, I don't know the answer, but it seems to me that if both sides tried to find some kind of cooperation prior to World War II, and if that event did not occur, perhaps many more Jewish lives would have been saved during World War II. But these are speculations. It is hard to talk about something that never actually was tested in real life. So this is essentially what I have to say. Ukrainians have been on all sides of the difficult period in question during World War II. So therefore, it hurts us. I'm speaking now not as a professor, I'm speaking now as a Ukrainian. It hurts us very much if we are exposed to blanket accusations as a nation or as a group of people. I think many speakers here today have said this, and the community at large, as far as I know, has nothing against apprehension or apprehending of the war criminals. But they have to be indicated by name, and they have to be proven as war criminals. And these kind of blanket accusations, wherever they come from, only inflame the situation and create the real approach that is the proper approach to that question, which ought to be continued and resolved, make it even more difficult. Thank you very much.